Hello for all of you learners. It's really good to see you. This is Tuesday. It's 2. So Tuesday at 2, I try to bring you some value. Tuesday at 2, value for you. I'm Jessica Travis, and what I do is I take science, research, sometimes complicated topics and concepts, but sometimes just science and research that not a whole lot of people like to look up and dig into. And then I try to digest it down and disseminate it into ways that are practical and ways that are easy for you and everybody else to practically use. So this is Mental Health Awareness Month. This is May 2020. And for the last few weeks, or this is the third week, we've been talking about mental health. Hello, everybody. We are in the midst of a global pandemic, and so I thought it would be a good idea to address something that I've heard a lot of people talking about, which is suicide. Now, I was just trying to get the very latest statistics on suicide, and I had already done research on the science of suicide, which I think you'll find very interesting, but the statistics are a little bit more tricky. A lot of people have been saying that with this global pandemic, suicide is going to go through the roof because people are frustrated, they're in despair, they feel like there's no hope, maybe they've lost their job. What the statistics that I'm looking at, the most recent, and what psychiatrists are saying right now is that what they anticipate is that for right now, suicides will stabilize or maybe even go down during the actual pandemic. What happens is that people tend to see and value life and the loss of life, and they tend to see people losing their lives unexpectedly and start to look at, wow, that person had a lot of life left to live. Maybe I won't go ahead and just be so cavalier with taking my own life. So that's interesting. If you were one of those people who thought, this is going to drive up the suicide rate, people are going to be so depressed and in so much despair that they're going to be killing themselves right and left. That actually, what the psychiatrists are saying, is not necessarily the case right now during the pandemic. Hey, by the way, if this was helpful, if you think that this topic is something that would be pertinent, why don't you start a watch party and put it on your page? If you have had people talking about this lately, if the whole topic of suicide has come up lately on your page or in your group of friends, this would be a really good idea to start a watch party and let people hear some of this information. Also, of course, you could share it. That's always a great thing to do, is share the information with your friends and family. You can share the video through Messenger. You can share it on your page, but sometimes doing the watch party catches people's attention so they'll be able to watch it live with us and they can actually comment and stuff. That's just an aside. But because I've seen this topic so much, I think it's a good idea to either watch party or share or get more people watching and engaging in this topic and clear up some of that. So what I just said, in case you did start a watch party or in case you did share it, what I just said was that a lot of people who were concerned about the increase of suicide during the pandemic and what psychiatrists in general and what the current statistics are showing so far is that there's actually been a lull in suicide. There's been less. And the reason that they're thinking is that when people see the loss of life unexpectedly, unless it was somebody who was your partner, your husband or wife, maybe passed away suddenly and you're an elderly person and for that reason now see no reason to live, that might be a reason for that particular person to go ahead and do this when they weren't planning on it before. But in general, the people who were predisposed to suicide, and we'll talk about who is more predisposed to suicide in a minute, those people right now are kind of chilling. They're kind of less likely to take that drastic step, because when they see loss of life around them, the perspective that puts them in is, I now see more value for my own life. I now see that life can be snatched away in a second, and I maybe have more to do. Maybe I have more to give, more life to live. Maybe I shouldn't just rashly do this, okay? Now, what they are finding is that in the past, when things happen financially, that's when people start to really go into despair. And I know that a lot of people have expressed concern for people committing suicide because of financial loss. What the psychiatrists, what the study that I was looking at was saying was that in about 132 people commit suicide per day in America. And that, since the year 2000, has gone up 35%. Since the year 2000, the rate of suicide has gone up since the year 2000. And it actually doubled right after the economic downturn in 2008. So what they were saying in this study was that once the financial implications really start to set in after the pandemic settles down, which is probably going to start to happen within the next 6 months or so, that will start to kick up or uptick the suicide rate, because of people not recovering financially and people seeing that their financial situation is worse than it had been in the past, and they don't see hope. And then you might start to see an uptick of suicide at that point. So that is definitely not to say that this pandemic will not affect suicide. What they're showing is that it probably won't affect it as much during, but then after, and the implications start to really show up financially, you might start to see an uptick then. Okay, that's just statistics, but I wanted to talk about the science of suicide, because it really has to do with a lot of what we've been talking about. And we've been talking about a lot of this already. There was an article called The Molecular Basis of the Suicidal Brain, and it talked about who commits suicide. Because when we look at people that do end up successfully taking their life, most of them have had ELA, early life adversity. And then again, we don't get to pick and choose who has had more of an adversity in their life than someone else. That's subjective. That is what that person's perception is. But in this study, they did look at family history of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and especially the rate of suicide went up when the person had been exposed to sexual or physical abuse by a closer family member for a longer period of time. So if the early life adversity happened via someone who was not close to the family, there was a lower risk of suicide. And if it happened once, but if it was someone close in a position of trust to the person, and it was something that happened more frequently, then the rate of suicide shot up. And the rate was as much as 75% of people who committed suicide, 73, had a history of childhood abuse. And again, the rate depended on the type and the frequency, the form, and the perpetrator. But that maltreatment during early development is huge, huge. When that child's mind is developing, when their trust is developing, that being treated poorly significantly increased the comorbidity. But how? How did it do that? That's what was so interesting. It showed that particularly the regulation of the HPA axis was thrown off. When they looked at these people, so a lot of times, well, every time when someone commits suicide, the tests are all done post-mortem, right? This person is now gone. We can't do these tests until the person, especially on the brain, until the person has actually passed away. They looked at the HPA axis and the level of cortisol in these people's bodies, and they saw that their HPA axis was all out of whack. Now, if you have missed in the past me talking about the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then the adrenal. And it's a cascade that starts with thoughts and starts with emotions, and then it goes and it kicks down into your body, and it kicks into your body releasing cortisol, which is a stress hormone. In these people, that was dysregulated, which really makes sense. Specifically, it was overactive. So then they were led to display heightened stress responsiveness. So the typical person's response to stress would be lower than this person who had the early life adversity and who was predisposed to suicide. They overreacted to stress, basically. So they weren't able to, we've talked about this before, handle stressful situations as well as somebody else. I'm going to interject here really quickly with an interesting statistic as well. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but the San Francisco Bay Bridge, there was an interesting story done about the 29 people who had actually survived their suicide attempt from that bridge. So they jumped off the bridge and survived the fall. All 29 said that they had instant regret. Instantly, as soon as they jumped off, they instantly regretted jumping. So again, we'll get into it just a minute more. This isn't going to be too long, but this was also seen in these people with early life adversity, which kicked up the HPA axis and had it overactive, that they had poor impulse control, that when they were faced with a stressful situation, that impulse, or normally people would pull back, they didn't have the control of that impulse, and so they just went ahead and did it. And those 29 all said that they immediately regretted it, and it was not a sense of relief, it was a sense of, why did I do that? And all of them said something to the effect of, they understood immediately that the problems and the situations and the thoughts that had led them to do what they did could have been solved, that they were all impermanent. They could all change, but they hadn't thought about that until they jumped. So again, the HPA axis, overactive. Another really interesting thing that this study showed, if I find it, was that they had lower levels of BDNF. Last time that we talked, we spoke of BDNF. We talked about how stimulating your vagus nerve and how regulating your breathing up would increase your level of BDNF, which is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. They all had low coding for that. So that's kind of interesting because we've talked about ways that you can increase that. What I'm trying to get at here is not just what is the science of suicide, but what can we do about it? Because obviously we're not going to be able to completely eliminate suicide at this moment, but can we maybe stop some of those situations? Can we intercept and help people to regulate this HPA, help them increase the BDNF so that they're much less likely to make that rash impulse decision that statistics show they would instantly regret. Not only would their family regret it, but they would regret it as soon as they did it. So that's why I'm kind of pointing out some of these things, because we've talked about ways that we can alter that. I talked about their impulse and aggressive traits were increased with these people that had the early life adversity. There, 40% of them had history of alcohol dependence and illicit substance dependence, but that also shows that they had poor impulse control. So people who have lower impulse control are more likely to abuse substances. They're also more, people who have early life adversity are also more likely to abuse substances so that they can drown out or block out the memories of that traumatic experience. We talked about, what else? There was one more thing that was really interesting. Oh, there was dysregulation of GABAergic signaling in the subcortical regions. So we have been talking about a system, and I'm plugging my course that's starting on June 1st, because we've been talking about how to adapt and overcome. And again, one of the thousands of types of receptors was underrepresented in the prefrontal cortex of people with major depressive disorder was for GABA, compared with non-depressed people. So we're talking about this system that we can use, and we're not just talking about using a substance. We're not just talking about using one tool. We're talking about a set of tools and an actual system that can help people to start to regulate and get a better control and management of their emotions over time. So when you have control and you're able to better manage your emotions and your thoughts in general in life, you are much more equipped to deal with adversity. You're much more resilient. You're much more able to feel equipped to handle the stressful events that life brings at you and not make rash decisions. So these people that did end up committing suicide, that did end up jumping off the bridge and immediately regretted it, saw that those thoughts and those problems and those emotions, they realized instantly that those were transient. And so that's what a lot of the system that we're introducing in the course starting on June 1st addresses. That how do we teach our brain that thoughts are not who we are, that problems, adversity, trials, challenges are not part of us, but they are something that is separate from us that we are experiencing, and that they pass, just like clouds in the sky pass. And so with science, it's proving that those neurotransmitters are actually transient too. And there are things that we can physically do. When we talked about breathing, we talked about signaling or kicking up the vagus nerve with breathing. We talked about different tools that we can use so that we can get a better handle and we can understand that we can control our neurotransmitters. Our neurotransmitters are not something that is just a genetic predisposition. It talked about in the study too, people who had suicide in their family being more predisposed to suicide if you had had a history of suicide in your family. But then they looked at, was that behavioral or was that actual genetic? Because when you have had something actually come to pass in your family, especially someone who had witnessed it, they had a much higher likelihood of committing suicide themselves. But can we say that was a genetic, or can we say that was you've actually seen someone perform this behavior, so you're more likely to perform this behavior? And they really couldn't say. There was really no way for them to take one and completely control for that, because you can't. What they did know for sure is that epigenetics is a real thing. And so no matter what your predisposition is and no matter what genetic predisposition you have, epigenetics, above that, you have power. There are things that you can do. And so we have all of those things that we can do. When the brain's not doing its proper job, we can train it to do its job much more effectively. We can train it to take and no longer get into these ruts. There was one last thing I was going to share. in suicidal, people who had suicidal thoughts, they would show these people pictures of angry faces, and people who had the suicidal ideation or thoughts overreacted to the angry faces. So they showed them a picture of someone with an angry face, and the person who had the suicidal tendency would be very, very affected by that angry face, where someone who didn't, and this did not have to do with their early life adversity, it just had to do with the suicidal thoughts. One distinction I wanted to make was the early life adversity increased the suicidal tendencies, the act, but it did not increase the suicidal ideation or thought specifically. So again, that speaks to how do we perceive what has happened to us. Yes, almost everybody who was suicidal had something happen to them, but lots and lots and lots and lots of other people had those same things happen to them and did not commit suicide. So it was their perception of what had happened to them. It was terrible what had happened to them, but there's something in between there that we can do, that can be done. We can't take away what had happened. That's happened. But the power lies with what we can do now. The power lies with how we can perceive it and how we can change the way that the brain responds to it. And that's what we're going to do in this course starting on June 1st. We're going to adapt and overcome. We're going to take the tools that we have, whether they be external tools, tracking tools, aromatherapy tools, herbal tools, specific exercises that we can do. All of that, we're going to take that and we're going to systematically apply it. And we're going to do that consistently. We're going to do that for 2 weeks in a row. And we're going to commit to that. And we're going to see just how far, with feedback and with tracking, what kind of progress that we can make. So I invite you to join us if you're interested at all in joining us in that. I'll put the registration link up here somewhere so that you guys can see it. If you haven't watched the webinar where I introduced this topic of Adapt and Overcome, make sure you watch it. And then you can register for the actual course, which is going to start on June 1st. I hope that this has been helpful. Learning about the science of suicide, that it is not something that you have to, because you're genetically disposed to it or because it's in your family, that is not your destiny. That does not have to be how your life ends. It doesn't have to be. I actually have a friend who is the founder of, if you've heard of Project Semicolon, his name is Michael Shields, and he is the co-founder of Project Semicolon, and that you've maybe have seen people with tattoos of a semicolon. That basically stands for, it's a semicolon. It's not a period. There's more after that. This isn't the end for you. So I've always liked his foundation, and hopefully we'll be able to work more together in the future. But that's what this is about. That does not need to be the end of your story. There's more to your story, but you need the tools. We don't just want to try and flail about and handle this on our own if we have not been given those tools. Most people have not been told these tools or taught these tools, which I really, really wish this was done in schools with little kids from the time that they're children, while that mind is developing. That's the key. That's when we really need to do this. But right now, we're concentrating on those of us who are already adults and who are experiencing the manifestation of this HPA axis going haywire. What can we do right now to get ourselves back on track? And then we can turn around and help more people, including the little guys, the little ones, because it's not going to be easier for them from here on out, is it? All right, I'm going to post the link to that registration, and I'll post a link to the webinar too in case you guys can't find it on the page. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day today. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Share this, please, with anyone or on any page where you feel that this could be beneficial, which I feel is every page. When you think of 132 people committing suicide every day, if that's how many are successfully committing suicide, how many people are contemplating it? Many, 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 many more. So let's share this and see how many people we can help with this vital information. Take care and have a wonderful day.